FitMind podcast.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so getting right into it here, you describe yourself as a thought addict, and I thought we could start there, and you could talk about what you mean exactly by that.
I'd be happy to. My name is Judd. I'm a recovering thought addict. If you think of addiction as the far end of a spectrum of habit formation, I like the simple definition of addiction: continued use despite adverse consequences. So let's start with what a habit is and how that forms into addictions, and then that will give some preface for how I'm a thought addict, to just add some background here. So very briefly, we learn most things that we do through reward-based learning. There's a trigger of behavior and a reward. This is set up to help us basically remember where food is and avoid danger. So if you see food, you eat the food, and then you get this dopamine signal from your stomach to your brain that says, remember what you ate and where you found it. You've just learned, where to find food. And then same thing happens. You see danger, you run away, and the reward is that you don't get eaten. Same thing. So very basic survival mechanism that's really helpful for us to learn things, right? So if we learn to tie our shoes through reward-based learning, it's very helpful, because if we had to relearn how to do every single thing from tying our shoes to putting our clothes on to eating, we'd be exhausted by breakfast. So forming habits is really helpful for survival, but when those are no longer helpful for us, that's where we can get into the spectrum of addiction: continued use despite adverse consequences. So, thinking, generally helpful. At least I find it generally helpful. But if I get caught up in my own thoughts, my own habit loops around thoughts where I'm thinking, it's like, oh, there's a great idea. There's a great idea. There's a great idea. And I'm not actually paying attention to the results of those ideas to see how rewarding they actually are. I could get addicted to thinking. So I saw this play out many, many times on meditation retreats, where I'd sit down and meditate and my brain would start thinking, oh, this is a great experiment. Yeah, why don't you do that experiment? And at first, it got me to get up and go and write down the idea. And after a while, I was like, wait a minute, I don't have that. I rarely have any good ideas. And I was like, I can't, clearly just because I'm on retreat doesn't mean I'm going to suddenly have a bunch of great ideas. I realized that my brain was just restless and didn't want to sit down and meditate and pay attention to what was going on. And so I realized, oh, this is, I'm just as addicted as anybody else. It just happens to be that this addiction is to thinking. It's more societally accepted. So I don't know if that answers your question around me being a thought addict, but the adverse consequences were that I couldn't concentrate. I couldn't actually pay attention to my experience enough to really dive in to understand my mind really well, because I was just stuck in, fantasies about great experiments, or, judging somebody or getting revenge on somebody or whatever, none of it having to do with what was actually happening in that present moment, which was me and my breath and my cushion and my body.
Yeah, well, I think it's a really important point, and it's one of the first things that you realize when you start meditating, is that your whole life you might have been identified with your thoughts, and you might think, I just am my thoughts, and then you start to realize that your mind, you aren't your thoughts, and your mind is trying to get you to do all sorts of things, solve all sorts of problems. And when you make the effort to just be present and enjoy the present moment, your mind does not like that very much. But I like it also because you framed addiction more generally as, look, we spend all day, our mind is gravitating towards certain things. And whether society doesn't think about a phone typically as an addiction, maybe it's starting to more and more.
I think it is.
Yeah, I think maybe now people are talking about it in the sense of addiction, but you can apply this to pretty much all of our automated habits that, as you say, that get continued despite adverse consequences. So how are you thinking about kind of reprogramming those addictions? Or maybe here we just get into your use of mindfulness to combat that.
Yeah. So the classical way that people have worked with habits and addictions, because I really think of these as a spectrum, is willpower. Just grit it out and, force yourself not to eat the cookie or smoke the cigarette or have the thought in my case, which got me sweating through t-shirts in the middle of winter on retreats. It was really exhausting. There's a growing body of research suggesting that not only willpower relies on the youngest part of our brain, which is the weakest part of our brain from an evolutionary perspective. So it's the first that goes offline when we get stressed out or when anything negative happens. But also starting to question, whether willpower is more heuristic as compared to something that's real. Cognitive control can be measured neurobiologically, but basic neuroscientists don't really talk about willpower because they're not really finding much evidence that supports that willpower exists. We can talk about that later, but let's just assume that there is willpower and that perhaps we get fatigued at the end of the day, and so we tend to act out our bad habits and our addictions at the end of the day, or during meditation retreats or whatever. If that process is not one that I would necessarily rely on, what can we rely on? And this is where my research goes. We've been studying this for over a decade now. Looking at reward-based learning, it's actually the strongest part of the brain. It's the most evolutionarily conserved learning process. So we asked the question, well, why not tap into that, something that's really, really strong as compared to something that's weak, like willpower? And we found that not only does mindfulness actually explain how it actually works theoretically to tap into that system, but we've done a bunch of studies now showing that it can actually do that with big results. So for example, theoretically, you could bring mindfulness in to help people notice that urge to act. And then, like for me, notice that urge to get off my cushion and write something down because I have the world's greatest thought. And just notice it as an urge and see what it feels like in my body. And notice that it's a physical sensation that comes and goes if I don't act on it. It also comes and goes if I act on it, but then I attribute causality. I'm like, oh, I have to act on this, right? And I get caught in the habit loop. But I can actually just sit there and watch that sensation come and go, and I don't have to act on it. And we did a clinical study, almost a decade ago now, with smokers to see if we could help them quit smoking. We got 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment. And we found mechanistically that we could actually decouple that urge to smoke and the smoking itself. Fast forward to this last year, we just published a paper where we showed that you could actually deliver that mindfulness training through an app. We made an app called Craving to Quit, where we could package that in a way that's accessible and delivered in context, because people learn in context. And we could actually show that we could change brain activity that predicts clinical outcomes, predicts reduction in smoking. So we can show this with these tangible benefits with smoking. We got a 40% reduction in craving-related eating in a study with an app called Eat Right Now. And we just finished 2 studies with an app called Unwinding Anxiety, where people use mindfulness training to help them unwind these habit loops around anxiety and worry. We got a 57% reduction in clinically validated anxiety scores in anxious physicians. And then we got a 63% reduction in these same scores in people with generalized anxiety disorder. So we're seeing it across a bunch of different clinical populations with clinically meaningful results, like 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment for smoking. That's a pretty good tangible outcome. With our anxiety program, 63% reduction. Man, if that were a pill, that would be like a blockbuster medication.
Yeah, well, it's really incredible. So you have these 3 different apps that folks should check out, and I'll put them all in the show notes. But you're helping anxiety, you're helping smoking cessation, and eating, right? So there's 3 kind of addictions there, and you might not think of anxiety as addiction, but that might go into your category of thought addiction, where it's just as depression. It's a story that's repeating in your mind that you're telling yourself over and over again, and it's incredible to me how just by shining the light of awareness on that, in all these cases, whether it's noticing the physical craving sensations in your body or shining the light of awareness on that thought loop as it's occurring in real time, that has this incredible potential to just kind of break that link between stimulus and response. So how does that translate into neurochemistry, or what's going on in the brain when that's actually happening?
Yeah, this is really cool because we just finished another study that suggests the mechanism here. So there's a part of the brain called the orbitofrontal cortex that determines and stores reward value, or is part of a complex of brain regions that does this, but this seems to be the hub. And so you can think of it as our brain is always comparing things when it's deciding to do a certain behavior. So let's use a simple example like chocolate for me. Milk, if I'm presented a choice of eating milk chocolate versus dark chocolate, for me, I like dark chocolate more than milk chocolate. So my brain picks dark chocolate, says I'd rather have dark chocolate. And that's that reward value, that reward hierarchy is stored in the orbitofrontal cortex. I think of it as the OFC as the BBO part of the brain. It's always looking for that bigger, better offer. So for me, dark chocolate's the BBO, is the bigger, better offer. So our brains have this hierarchy set up, and often the reward value for things gets laid down early in life, right? So let's use chocolate or chocolate cake as an example. So every time when we were a kid and we went to a birthday party or had a birthday party, we often got cake, right? And so you associate cake with friends and presents and ice cream and all this. And every time you go to or have a birthday party, that reward value gets reinforced over and over and over. So when we're in our 40s, our brain just looks at cake and it's like, eat it, because that reward value is there. It's kind of habitual because we haven't actually updated the reward value to, am I actually hungry? And is this going to actually feel good after I eat it, right? When we're 5, cake always feels good. Whereas when I'm, when I'm not 5 anymore, eating sugar and carbohydrates actually gives me a sugar rush and then I crash. It's just not that pleasant compared to eating, like a whole food plant-based diet or something like that. So what we have to do is actually bring awareness in now and say, how rewarding is this right now? So that we can help our brain update the reward value to see, if it's an old behavior, how unrewarding it is, so that opens the space for a BBO where we can actually bring in some other bigger, better offer. A tangible example, we have people pay attention when they smoke. They realize, wow, smoking doesn't really taste very good. It tastes like shit. But they've stored this reward value from when they were 13 and being rebellious and learning to be cool at school or whenever they learned to smoke. And they carry that forward because they're not paying attention to the reward value, what it actually tastes and smells like now. So we built a craving tool basically into our smoking and our Eat Right Now app to actually help people pay attention as they eat or as they smoke. And we can measure the reward value, the change in reward value over time as people use this tool. And we've found that it takes as few as 10 to 15 times of people really paying attention as they do the behavior to update that reward value, which plays out or is reflected in a reduction in craving when they have an urge to do that behavior. So we can actually see, we haven't lined that up to the brain yet, but that is called Rescorla-Wagner curves. We've actually plugged it into these Rescorla-Wagner curves, which have been shown pretty, in a pretty reproducible manner to line up with brain activity in the striatum and all these reward centers. So behaviorally, we're seeing a reduction in reward value simply by bringing awareness to the direct behavior. And theoretically, that's changing that reward value simply by helping the orbitofrontal cortex update what the actual value is now as compared to what that stored composite value was from the past. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. And I think one of the really interesting connections I made between your book and I was listening to Joseph Goldstein, who's, for the listeners, a very experienced meditation teacher. And so in your book, you mentioned that the dopamine reward system, the dopamine that your brain gets at first it's paired with the reward, but then it starts to pair earlier with actually just the stimulus. So even thinking about the chocolate cake starts to feel pleasant. And it's interesting because Joseph Goldstein observed that experientially. He was talking on another podcast, and he said, I don't know what's going on here in the brain, but it feels to me like even just thinking about the cup of tea that I really want starts to feel really good. So it starts to feel just as good as the actual cup of tea. So to me, and this is kind of what you're doing in your work too, is you're educating folks, because you say in your book, like half the battle is just recognizing how the system works, but not just intellectually, like in a textbook, I can tell you how the different things connect, but actually maybe in the textbook at first, so then you can notice it happening in your mind as it happens. And that seems to just recognizing how that process works seems to have such a powerful effect. It seems to lose its power over us.
Yeah, I think of that as concepts in the service of wisdom, right? So concepts can get us moving. It's really helpful to know what to look for or to kind of understand intellectually how something works. But then, that's like empty calories. If we read a book and we're like, oh, that sounds great. Let me read another book. Let me read another book. It's really different than like reading a book, understanding a concept, and then practicing it and developing wisdom from our own direct experience. That's what sticks with us. That's like meat on our bones. That's not empty calories. And so I think that's really what gets us to change behavior, is not understanding something intellectually, but having that filter down into our direct experience so we develop wisdom from experience.
You also talk a lot in your book about subjective bias as kind of a root mechanism. And I thought maybe we could touch on that, because it was really enlightening for me to learn about just kind of how the brain starts to be driven by its previous interactions with the world to then start perceiving the world through a certain lens.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So reward-based learning sets up a bias for seeing the world differently. So for example, if I eat dark chocolate and it tastes better than milk chocolate, my brain lays down that memory that says preference for dark chocolate. So when I look around the world, I don't have to learn everything fresh again, right? It can save my cognitive resources to learn other things. When I see a choice of chocolate, my brain says, just do that, right? So the subjective bias, for me, is dark chocolate glasses, but it can happen for any of us in many different ways. For somebody who has anxiety, they could be wearing the worry glasses, where they're always looking around worrying about what could go wrong, or anticipating the future, or perseverating about what might go wrong. People that wear the depression glasses see the world through a depressive lens, where they're always ruminating. They're ruminating about the past. So you can see how subjective bias just drives how we see the world and how we interpret stimuli based on what our previous conditioning is.
Right. Yeah, and it makes so much sense, because the brain, is not just trying to see the world as it is in reality. It's trying to perceive our environments as they would have helped us pass on our genes and evolve. So it seems to me that also there was, this subjective bias is created not only by our conditioning throughout our entire lifetime, but also previous generations that their conditioning has been built into us. So, maybe the Buddha would refer to that as karma or something, but the fact is we're not born in this world as blank slates. And so I don't have to be taught that social gratification feels good. But then where the modern world comes in is that I learned to pair a thumbs up on Facebook with that social gratification. So a lot of the fundamental framework that's been laid by evolution is getting hijacked by all of our modern conveniences, and just by companies that are taking advantage of that in a lot of ways. So what I like about your work is you've really put the consumer in the driver's seat, and you're saying, look, in a lot of ways our brains are maladapted. All these circuits have kind of been hijacked, but it's your responsibility you have the power. It's very empowering, your message, because you have the power to rewire those circuits and to actually choose the way that you want to interact with the world. You're not completely helpless against it.
Yeah, it's not a complex concept. It's simple. It's not easy to change behavior, but it's simple, and it's simple enough that social media, for example, these companies can really take advantage of that to get us addicted to the likes or get us addicted to the food, if it's food corporations or whatever. And we can understand this as well ourselves so that, we can take responsibility, like you're saying, to be able to step out of the process through our own learning. And, it's relatively straightforward. And as I pointed out, even delivering mindfulness training through app-based programs can be tremendously helpful for folks for stepping out of that.
Mm. Yeah, so I want to make sure that in the last few minutes we have together, we also just, because you're kind of on the cutting edge research here of meditation and the mind, and as well as addiction, what is some of the most exciting research that you're doing or that you're excited to learn in the near future? Like what kind of cutting edge stuff is going on? I see, looks like Good Will Hunting has been developing formulas on your whiteboard behind you there. So
that's right.
What should we be excited about in this world of neuroscience and meditation?
I think one thing that we are really excited about is looking at these reward value changes. And we'd love to start to do studies to link those behavioral changes that we're seeing with brain changes and changes in, brain activity, brain connectivity, because it'd be really interesting to see, from a neurobiologic mechanistic perspective, to see if that reward value is actually changing in a tangible way in the brain. Now, my lab is always focused on pragmatics. So, just understanding some neurobiologic mechanism is kind of a so what question for me. As an addiction psychiatrist, I have tons of patients who are suffering big time in the world. And, if I could say, oh, look at what's happening in your brain, and, that doesn't help them tangibly. But if we can develop neurofeedback tools where we can pinpoint specific mechanistic changes in the brain, we can potentially use this as a way to give people neurofeedback as they're learning to meditate, or as they're learning to pay attention to their direct experience. So we might be able to accelerate the process of that concept landing in people's direct experience and have them really, really get this stuff more quickly.
Do you think there's any consumer devices available now that are helpful for that, or are these all currently too expensive for your everyday person to afford?
Yeah, there's no consumer device on the market that I would recommend right now.
The Muse is not, you don't think it's accurate or helpful?
I don't want to comment on any specific commercially available devices, but I can say that, we've been doing neurofeedback research for several years now. Almost, I guess, 8 years or something like that. And the EEG rig that we use for neurofeedback is an $80,000 rig. And we've gotten it from like 128 leads to get good, source localization where you can pinpoint specific brain regions down to about 32. But there aren't any commercially available products that can actually pinpoint specific brain regions like we are doing, which seems to give us specificity around neural mechanisms. So, I would say caveat emptor, buyer beware, and make sure whatever you're doing is neurobiologically based. And I would have to say there's not a lot out there that I've seen that is neurobiologically based yet. My hope is that there will be companies out there excited to take, these types of research concepts and move them into the commercial realm. We'd be happy to help support things like that, but companies have their own agendas. So I would guess maybe in 5, certainly in 10 years, we're going to see much more refinement and much more scientific basis around these things, and that companies are going to take these out to the world and help people with them.
Yeah, well, I can't wait for that to happen. And listen, thanks for all the research you're doing and for taking the time to share some of it with us on the podcast. Really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.